Hi, my name is Stacey Goodman, and I am the Yoetzet Halacha for Philadelphia and Las Vegas. And I'm here with Rabbi Gedalia Berger, who was my teacher in the Miriam Globach Center for Training Yoetzot in America. And we are here to talk about bathtubs and swimming pools. So I'm going to be asking Rabbi Berger questions, and he's going to be sharing his knowledge on this topic with us. COVID-19 has created unprecedented times for everyone in the world. Rabbis and Yoetzot have received questions that had rarely been asked in our modern post-Holocaust world. We found ourselves looking at texts from the early sources that we never thought would be relevant in our time. With strict lockdowns and quarantines around the world, in the shadow of a highly contagious and deadly virus, women were feeling anxious about leaving their homes for any reason, let alone going to the mikveh. While we had many assurances that the chemicals added to the water of the mikveh rendered them safe, and miraculously, most mikvaot around the world were able to continue to function, albeit with modified rules such as no preparation and only one woman at a time, we were still concerned. Women started to wonder why they had to leave their homes at all. What was wrong with their bathtub or swimming pool? Surely, compromises and leniencies could be found in the face of this highly contagious disease. Certain opinions were even floating around the internet that seemed to allow the use of bathtubs and swimming pools, while others were strictly forbidding their use. Today, we are fortunate to have with us the esteemed Rabbi Gedalia Berger, Magi Chair for the Yoetzet Halacha program at Nishmat Miriam Globach Center, who will help us to understand the halachic issues surrounding bathtubs and swimming pools and whether they are different from mikvaot. I'm going to begin my questions to Rabbi Berger, and the audience is welcome to submit questions that I'll be able to read. Some of them we can answer immediately, and some we'll save for the end of the chat. So to begin our first questions, before we begin, we need to understand the halachic differences between swimming pools and bathtubs. We'll need to address each one separately, as a bathtub is a kli, a fashioned man-made vessel, whereas a pool is a hole that's dug in the ground. So we'll have to learn about the different halachot that affect each one. Let's begin with the pasuk in the Torah that is the basis for all of these halachot. It's in Vayikra, Perek Yud Aleph, pasuk Lamed Vav, and it says, Ach mayan uvor mikveh mayim yeh tahor v'nogea b'nivlatam itma. However, a spring or cistern in which water is collected shall be clean, but whoever touches such a carcass in it shall be unclean. Rabbi Berger, can you talk about what we learned from this pasuk, specifically the words tahor, mayan, which is a spring, bor mikveh, and bor mikveh mayim, and how it is later developed through the rabbis of the Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara? Can you explain the terms mekabel tuma, whether a material can even become tameh, and mayim she'uvim, which is water drawn by a human with the intent to collect it, like from a well into a bucket, and the halachic significance with regard to mikveh as opposed to bathtubs and swimming pools?
Okay. Thank you, Stacey, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be a part of this really wonderful conference. And in a moment, I'm going to begin our analysis of this topic by addressing those fundamental questions that Stacey just raised. Let me open, though, just with a couple of comments more broadly about the situation which Stacey described in the time of coronavirus, which generated this issue and which is important as a framework for addressing these issues from a halachic perspective. First of all, as with most complex halachic issues, the topics we're going to be addressing tonight are rather extensive, and we're only going to be able to address them in summary. I should mention that this topic was of such significance to the Yoetzot Halacha during the early months of the coronavirus pandemic that a group of them asked me to give a shiur on this topic during those early months, I gave those shiurim last May because of how many women were calling them troubled by this challenge of and worry about going to the mikveh with worries of infection. And I gave a very in-depth shiur to them. I also gave a shiur on this topic in the Lamdenu program in Teaneck, in which I teach. This is a topic which has been of great interest to many people. One further comment before we start to address the substance, and that is, obviously, and the way that, Stacy, that you posed the question is, of course, acknowledges this. The question here isn't really, why do we have mikvahs at all? And why don't we just always go to the mikvah in a swimming pool or a bathtub? I think people recognize that there are halachic hurdles to be overcome, and that there's a reason why we have mikvahs built in a very special manner. The question here is, can we be more makil? Can we be more lenient about certain aspects of halachos mikvahos, of the halachos of mikveh, given the very, very challenging circumstances that we're in? And the great challenge of these circumstances is twofold. Number one is the concern for infection and the pikuach nefesh, the care which we always give to protecting life, and how that obviously influences halachic decision making in a very dramatic manner. In this case, there is another consideration that comes along with it, which is not so much the actual pikuach nefesh, but simply the great hardship that people faced because of their anxieties and their concerns and their worries about going to the mikveh. And even if a mikveh was deemed safe by people who were running it or by medical personnel, there were still a lot of people who found it very difficult to go despite that, because of how terribly anxious they were, very understandably, in the context of the pandemic. That poses a more complex challenge to those who are making halachic decisions, in that, on the one hand, there are objective issues of safety to take into account. And on the other hand, even if the safety issues are addressed, there are more subjective issues of, is the hardship that people are facing because of their worries, is that also a sufficient reason to be more lenient about one halachic issue or another? And those are the kinds of calculations that poskim, that people who are making halachic decisions have to take into account and need to be weighed very carefully, given the seriousness of the halachic issues involved. So I just wanted to say that just to give a general framework for the mindset involved in addressing this kind of issue. Okay, so now let me turn to the substance of the issue. As Stacy said, there's a pasuk in Sefer, there's a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra that provides for us the source for the whole idea of a mikveh, and we're gonna put this up on the screen for at least a little bit. And this pasuk in Parshas Shmini says, "Ach ma'ayan uvor mikveh mayim yihya tahor," whereas water is usually something that can become tameh, that can contract tuma from a source of impurity, from a source of tuma. If the water is the water from a natural spring, that's what a ma'ayan means, or if it's a bor mikveh mayim, it's a pit, water collected in it. The word mikveh simply means collected. That word appears, might be familiar to some of you from the very beginning of the Torah in Parshas Bereishis, where yikavu hamayim, that the water collects in one place. That water yihya tahor, that if the water that it presents in that kind of circumstance, a spring or a bore, a pit with collected water, is tahor, does not become tameh. And as Rashi points out here on the Rashi on Chumash here at the bottom of this page says, not only does this pasuk mean that water that's in the ground like that can't become tameh, it also means hatovel bahem yikeh tahor hatovel bahem mitumaso. That it also means that someone who immerses in such a body of water can become tahor, can become purified from any tumah that he or she has. This is the basic source for the notion that a mikveh is the type of body of water that serves the purpose of being metaher someone, of making someone pure again, including, of course, a woman who was a nida, which is the context of all of our concerns and all of our discussion. Although I should mention that the rules for mikveh are not unique to nida, they apply to all applications of mikveh for all forms of tumah for gerus, for conversion, for tevilas kelim, and so forth. So those are the only few words that we have in the Torah about what defines a mikveh. And of course, the Torah Shebaal Peh provides a lot more detail, and a host of those details are in fact deduced from some of the language in this pasuk. Now, we're obviously not going to give a survey of all of the halachos of mikveh, but what we do want to do is list the particular basic halachos of mikveh that become relevant for our discussion. And three of those halachos are learned from this pasuk, and they're learned from this pasuk in a midrash halacha in the Toras Kohanim, which is the halachic midrash on Sefer Vayikra, and that's what appears here on page 2. Okay, in the interest of time, we're not going to be reading through this. I should mention that a lot of the sources in this booklet, which is rather long, we're not going to be reading together. They're there for your reference. We will be looking together more carefully at a couple of pages. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and just describe a summary of the three important halachos that are learned from this pasuk that are developed in that midrash. The first one is that in order for a mikveh to be a mikveh, it has to be bakarka, it has to be in the ground. A mikveh the pool of water that's a mikveh can't be inside some other object, like the example given in the Midrash in a boat, for example, and it can't be in a kli. Now, I should just introduce that's a word we're going to be using constantly during the course of this discussion, the word kli. A kli simply means a vessel or a utensil, and it has certain important halachic definitions, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so the first halacha is that a mikveh must be in the ground. It can't be inside something else. Something which is firmly attached to the ground is generally considered like part of the ground. So if there's a building, then that building is like that has a foundation and is attached to the ground. So a mikveh that's inside of that is still considered like it's inside the ground. That's number one. Number two is this minimum size of a mikveh. A mikveh needs to be and I should mention that the fact that the mikveh has to be in the ground is learned from the word in the pasuk ma'ayan. A ma'ayan means a spring, which is a natural spring. So even a mikveh, which is a collected body of water, also has to be similar to the ma'ayan in that it is in the ground. The second halacha is that this is the minimum size of a mikveh. That's relatively simple. That the halacha is that the minimum size of a mikveh is 40 sa'ah. Sa'ah is a halachic measurement. And there is some debate as to exactly how big that is in contemporary terms. It's somewhere in the general range of several hundred liters of water that constitutes the minimum size of a mikveh. Somewhere between 300 something and 900 something, depending on the opinion that you follow. So that's number two. Number three, which is the one that is going to occupy most of our discussion tonight, is that the water that's in a mikveh may not be she'uvin. It can't be water that is drawn. It has to be water that collected in a fashion that is somewhat natural. And the basic definition of she'uvim, of mayim she'uvim, that is not cannot be used for a mikveh, is that it was collected in a kli. That's why the definition of kli is so important. It was collected in a utensil by a human being, not necessarily with his or her hands, but just with the intent of a person, that before getting to the mikveh, it was first collected in a kli. Such water is forever puzzles cannot be used for a mikveh. So those are the three important basic halachos that are learned from this pasuk and this medrash. It has to be in the ground, it has to be 40 sa'ah, and it can't be from mayim she'uvim, from drawn water. There are two other halachos that I want to mention more quickly that don't come from this medrash. One, which appears in a Gemara in Zevachim that is also in the source booklet, says, actually, in the interest of time, I'm not even going to introduce that now. If we have time later, I'll bring it up later. Let me leave that out for now. Let me just mention one more thing, and that is the following. What qualifies as a kli according to halacha, and this is another one of the questions that Stacy raised at the beginning, in order for something to qualify as a kli according to halacha, depends possibly on what area of halacha you're talking about. A kli is important for it because it's part of what's necessary to define mayim she'uvim. But there are other areas of halacha in which the definition of a kli is also important. One familiar example might be netilas yadayim, right? You have to use a kli to put the water in to wash your hands. And the definition of a kli for that purpose isn't necessarily the same as the definition of a kli for every other purpose. The most extensive discussion of the definition of kelim in halacha is in the realm of what's called kabbalas tuma, that in order for an object to be able to be susceptible to becoming tameh, it has to be a kli. And we are going to be coming across during the course of our discussion certain aspects of the definition of a kli for the purposes of kabbalas tuma, and some of that is going to be applicable also to the definition of mayim she'uvim. I know to some degree I'm speaking a little bit in abstractions now, but as we get more into the middle of the material, this will become much more concrete. The main issue of all of the above that's going to occupy us the most is the issue of mayim she'uvim, and the core one of the key questions that we're going to face is the question of the use of water from a municipal water system for a mikveh, and that is something that we're going to be addressing very, 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 very soon. Before I pass the baton back over to Stacy, let me just quickly review a couple of important details about this rule of mayim she'uvim. So water that was collected first in a kli can never be used for a mikveh. However, that's only true if you're creating the mikveh from scratch. But if you've already made a mikveh with kosher water and it's already reached the minimum size of 40 sa'ah, so I have 1,000 gallons of naturally collected rainwater, once that's there, I can add more water that's mayim she'uvim and it won't make the mikveh pasul. The mayim she'uvim is a problem only if it's part of the initial creation of the mikveh. Okay, that's one important detail. A second detail is that even a relatively small amount of mayim she'uvim makes a mikveh not acceptable. So if I have my initial few hundred liters of water that are the mikveh, even if only what's in halacha called 3 lugin, which is about 1 quart of water, with mayim she'uvim, that pasels the whole mikveh. That makes the whole mikveh not good, at least midrabanan. The final detail I'll mention, and then I'll hand it back to Stacy, is that, and this is something that's worth a more careful investigation, but for the purposes of this 1 hour shiur, I'll just state it as a simple matter, which is that the fact that mayim she'uvim may not be used for a mikveh, there is with regard to that, there is a debate among the Rishonim and the Poskim whether the problem of the use of mayim she'uvim for a mikveh is a deoraisa problem or a derabanan problem. Is it biblical halacha or is it a rabbinically legislated halacha? And the Rama in the Shulchan Aruch, who is the posek for Ashkenazim, clearly states that we paskin that this is a deoraisa problem, whereas the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch, who is the source of psak for Sephardic Jews, is ambiguous on this matter, and there are among the Sephardic poskim those who take the position that mayim she'uvim is only a derabanan problem, which would then impact how seriously we take it in some of these more challenging applications. Okay, so that's I hope that I didn't just bombard you with too much material all at once. But as I said before, once we start to look more carefully at things, I think that this will become more concrete and clear. Okay, Stacy.
Thank you, Rabbi Berger. I think an important thing for all of us to realize, and one of the things that I left with when you gave the Yoatzot, the special class on this, was just how little we know about this, and that it's not a decision that can be made lightly. So we appreciate you giving the time and explaining this to us. So now we're going to actually explore more specifically the municipal water system and how it impacts mikveh construction. So is it possible that is the natural rainwater, goes into the municipal water system and comes out of our faucets, that it could still be considered natural water for the purpose of considering a bathtub or in-ground swimming pool a kosher mikveh. Could you explain how the pipes might either help or hinder us in concluding whether a bathtub attached to the ground could be a mikveh, especially in light of the Industrial Revolution, when people began living further away from natural bodies of water and in urban areas where water tanks are common in the water system?
Okay. So this question, the question of what's the status of water from the tap and can it be used for a mikveh? That is the key issue in answering one of the two questions that's on the table here, which is the question of swimming pools. Okay, if you think about it, as I think Stacy mentioned this in her initial comments, a swimming pool is basically almost indistinguishable from a mikveh, right? When a person goes to the mikveh, what's the mikveh? It's a hole in the ground. Well, a swimming pool, of course, an in-ground swimming pool that we're talking about, that somebody might have in their backyard, is a hole in the ground. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the swimming pool itself that would render it not good to be used for a mikveh. The major problem is there are certain other problems that would need to be dealt with, but the major problem is how's the water getting there? And so the key question here is the water from the tap kosher to be used for a mikveh? Meaning, is it in fact mayim she'uvim or not? So let's go back to our basic definition of mayim she'uvim. Has the water, before getting to the mikveh, has it been collected intentionally in a kli? So now let's begin to look at the key, more narrow definitions that become very important here. In order for water to be mayim she'uvim, it has to be collected in a particular type of kli. It has to be collected in a kli which actually can collect things. What's known in halacha as a kli that has a beit kibul, a base kibul, meaning it has an interior space. Right? I could have a kli that's flat. I can have a knife as a kli, right, as a useful item. But it doesn't have an interior space where it can collect something. In order for it to be considered mayim she'uvim, drawn water that's been collected, it has to have been inside a kli that can actually collect something. As opposed to what I think is the misconception of some, pipes do not render water mayim she'uvim. Because regardless of what the pipe is made out of, okay, whether it's clay or metal or plastic, the pipe is not a kli that has a base kibul. A pipe cannot collect water in it because a pipe is open on one end, it's open on the other, and the water just goes right through it. It doesn't collect in any particular space. A kli that to make mayim she'uvim has to have kind of a rim on all four sides, which a pipe doesn't have. And it doesn't matter how long the pipe is. So if the reservoir where the water is collected, and that's just usually a natural lake, and the water then goes into a pipe and ends up through a whole piping system to get into my swimming pool, right? That does not make it mayim she'uvim, according to just about anybody. And therefore, the real question of whether one can use municipally provided water for a mikveh has to do with the question of whether there are other parts of the municipal water system besides the pipes that in fact do create mayim she'uvim. Are there points along the way where the water is collected in some kli or another between here and there? Now, the answer is sometimes it is. And in order to fully address this issue, we need to introduce another key issue in the definition of kelim for the purpose of mayim she'uvim. And here, let me share the screen once again. And we are going to look here at this page at a couple of sources here. The Mishnah says in Maseches Kelim, Kol kali matechos sheyesh lo shem bifnei atzmo tameh. Any metal vessel, any metal kli, I'm not going to bother with translating the rest of that. It's not important for us. Is tameh, means it is susceptible to becoming tameh. It's a kli for the purposes of that halacha. Chutz min hadeles, except for a door, and the ... there indicates that there's a list of other things that are similar to a door. What's special about a door and the other things on this list? Shenasu lakarka, because a door that was constructed for use in a house is intended to be used while attached to the ground. Therefore, it does not qualify as a kli. Okay, this introduces us to the very important halacha in the realm of defining kalim, which is going to accompany us through much of this discussion, which is that, generally speaking, things which are attached to the earth are not considered a kli. Now, what we're going to have to examine more carefully is, what did I mean by generally speaking? Okay, we're going to have to be more careful about it. But the basic idea here is that something which is what's called mechubar lakarka, attached to the ground, is not in the category of a kli. And so, since the door is attached to the house, and the house has a foundation and is firmly ensconced in the ground, a door is not considered a kli. That's the basic idea. We then, however, find another source that tells us about a different scenario. This is a Mishnah that's quoted in the Gemara in Bava Basra. Daf shel nachtomin shekva'o bakotel, Rabbi Eliezer mitaher v'chachamim mitamin. Here's another type of kli which is attached to the ground. It's a daf, means it's basically the shelf of a baker. Nachtomim are bakers, and it basically refers to a display shelf in a bakery. That's a shelf that's attached to the wall of the bakery, on which they display their products. We're going to focus only on the opinion of the Chachamim, which is the opinion that we follow, that daf, that shelf, is makabel tuma, is considered a kli. And so what we have here are two Mishnayos, one of which talks about a kli, about something not being considered a kli because it's attached to the ground, and another Mishnah in which something which is attached to the ground still is considered a kli. The Chachamim say that it is considered a kli even though it's attached to the ground. Now, this generates the necessity in the later halachic literature among the Rishonim and the Achronim to try to come up with a way of distinguishing between these two cases. What's the difference between the door and the shelf? And why is the door not a kli and the shelf is a kli? And in the literature of the Achronim, there is a tremendous number of efforts to resolve this problem, to explain the difference between these two categories. And it is beyond the scope of the time that we have to be able to go through what those answers are and what the potential dividing lines are between these two categories. For the purposes of this discussion, we simply are going to need to acknowledge and be aware, and that's what I have set up in that chart that you have on that page, which is that there are two categories. There's category one, which is represented by the paradigm of the door, and category number two, which is represented by the paradigm of the shelf. And again, I apologize that we can't go into what defines the different categories here. But there's one type of kli that, when attached to the ground, there's one kind of scenario in which it is not a kli. That's category one. Okay, and there's another type of kli that's attached to the ground that is considered a kli. What we need to do, though, is look for a moment at the rest of that source, which we haven't looked at yet, which is going to provide the background for the somewhat more complicated last column in this right to left chart. And that is that, actually, maybe we won't read the Gemara. I think I'm just going to say it outside in the interest of time. The Gemara says the following. The Gemara says that with regard to category number two, while the baseline halacha is that it is considered a kli, that's not always true. There's a distinction, says the Gemara, between whether it was formed as a kli first before it was attached to the ground. Then it kind of already had an identity as a kli, and then by attaching it to the ground later, that can't remove its status as a kli. And it remains considered a kli even after you've attached it to the ground. Whereas if you took your raw material and you attached it to the ground first, and it already kind of became part of the earth, and then you kind of dug it out and fashioned it into a kli, then we can be more makel, we can be more lenient and consider it not a kli, but as the chart indicates, only for the purposes of dinim derabanan, of rabbinic issues, but not for the purposes of dinim doraisa, for biblical issues. Okay, so as you can see, even having left out all of the details of what the Achronim say, this is a rather complex issue. Okay, so for any kli that's attached to the ground that we encounter, we need to answer three questions in order to establish whether it's considered a kli. Number one, is it part of category number one or part of category number two? And if it's part of category number two, was it fashioned first or was it attached to the ground first? And if it was attached to the ground first and then fashioned, are we talking about a d'oraisa issue or a d'Rabbanan issue? And if we follow that flow chart, then we'll be able to address this question. And so to now translate all of this into specifically the Mayim She'uvim context. So that's what I did on the in that flow chart on the bottom of the page. So and now let's now think about this real life case. So just to highlight, obviously, why are we talking about this? Because most of the elements of the municipal water system are in fact affixed to the ground, right? They're not just something that's sitting somewhere in a room, right? They're underground and dug in and attached. And so if we face such issues in the municipal water system, that's usually what we're going to be facing. And so as it says there on the screen, if water is collected in a vessel that is anchored in the ground, does it become mayim she'uvim and therefore unfit for use in a mikveh? So we want to know, when the water comes out of the tap after having passed through some of these potential kalim, is it no good for the mikveh or not? So if it's in category, if that kli is in category number one, then it's not mayim she'uvim. It's not a kli because it's attached to the ground, and you could use that water for the mikveh. If it's in category number two, for whatever reason, again, we haven't defined those categories, then it will depend whether it was created first or affixed to the ground first. And if it was affixed to the ground first, then for Doraisa applications, it is Mayim Shuvim. For the Rabbanon applications, it is not Mayim Shuvim. And which is therefore going to require us to decide, is Mayim Shuvim a Doraisa or Rabbanon, which is one of the introductory issues I mentioned earlier. If the Mayim Shuvim issue that we're facing is a Doraisa issue, then it is going to be Mayim Shuvim regardless of any of these considerations. If we're talking about a Rabbanon issue, then it is then it might not be Mayim Shuvim. Okay, so that is an outline of the issues. Again, somewhat of a bare outline, but of the complicated issues that confronted the Achronim when addressing this issue. It's worth making a note, which Stacy already referred to, which is why do I keep talking about the Achronim and not the Rishonim? Why do I keep talking about the more recent poskim of the last few hundred years and not the medieval poskim? And the answer to that has to do, as Stacy said, with the changes in society during the last few hundred years, and the urbanization of Jewish communities, and the need, therefore, for artificially created mikvahos rather than just the use of natural bodies of water. And so these issues faced poskim more in the more recent centuries. Okay, so with that background, let's just take a look at one or two sources that actually talk about in real time this issue. So this is a passage from the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, Rav Yechiel Michael Epstein, lived in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, and he was the Rav of Nevardak. And he writes here, "V'yesh mikvos ba'arim hagadolos." There are mikvos in the big cities. Shebisham holchim hamayim mehanaharos l'chol batei ha'ir. The water goes from the rivers, from the natural sources of water to all of the buildings in the city. Derech tzinoros v'silonos tachas hakarka ba'omek, that through piping that is deep under the ground. V'nikra b'lshon haMedina, and it's called in the language of the country, vada pravadin, which is, I assume, some way of saying water providing of something like that. Even though he lived in Navarduk, apparently this was English words were used for the description of this. I imagine that some of the technology probably came from Great Britain. In any case, umamshichin gam lemikvos hamayim ha'elu. And this water that's coming from this water system is brought to the mikvos also. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read the next few lines. I'm just going to say outside here what he says. What he says in the next few lines is that when you're using this water for the mikveh, there is one thing you have to be careful about. Okay. The thing that he says you have to be careful about is a minor matter. And he, in this passage, takes for granted that the water from the tap is in fact being used for the mikveh and is kosher for a mikveh. And not only does he take it for granted as a matter of halacha, he takes it for granted as a matter of practice, right? What he's writing here is a description that in many of the big cities in Europe, in Jewish communities in the 19th century, they in fact used tap water for the mikveh, indicating that they did not consider this a problem, that they didn't consider the water from the municipal water system to be mayim shuvim. And that was because they didn't think that there were any kalim that created mayim shuvim along the way. Okay, with this, I have to try to be a little more concise with the time here. So without reading this through, I'll just point out there's the next several pages in the booklet are of interest. They are from a sefer called Taras Mayim, which was written by Rav Nissen Telushkin, who was an activist with regard to mikvos in America. And what he does there is he says, you know what, in order to find out whether there are kalim that create mayim shuvim in the water system, you have to actually know something about municipal water systems. And he himself, this was in the 1920s, spent a lot of time learning in great detail about the New York City water system and learned everything that there was to know about it. And he discovered that, generally speaking, there was no place where water was collected in the water system, but that there were certain neighborhoods that were very high altitude that needed the water to be collected in a special kind of tank that was used to help boost the water up to the higher altitudes. And so he said that in those neighborhoods where there's actually tanks that were in which the water was collected, he said that created a problem of mayim shuvim. And he then points out that depending on exactly what you think about the details of the issue that we talked about before, right, on that previous page where we had the chart, well, even if there are tanks that were in the water system, it still might be okay. It still might not be mayim shuvim if you can manage to shoehorn the case into this last category where it would not be mayim shuvim. So what he concludes is that his view was that where there are tanks, you can't use the water for a mikveh, but that it's a legitimate position to say that even where there are tanks, you could use that water for the mikveh. And now, just to conclude this part of the discussion, historically, in fact, as you saw with the Aruch HaShulchan, there's a period in history where municipal water was routinely used in order to fill up mikvahos, and some of that was because there were no tanks. Some of that might have been because some people held that the tanks were not a problem. Some of it might have been, frankly, because some of the rabbanim involved might not have understood the municipal systems well enough, and maybe some errors were made along the way. That's possible. But that's a general overview of this issue. If, in fact, one comes to the conclusion, and I should mention, but in the last 3/4 of a century or so, it has become the general standard to not use municipal water for a mikveh, because it's so difficult to find out all the proper details of exactly how each municipality's water system works. Also, the municipal water system is constantly changing, and depending on exactly what your psak halacha is, that could affect whether the water is kosher for the mikveh. So the long-standing practice now is to not use municipal water for a mikveh. But what does that mean for the coronavirus pandemic? Somebody says, I want to use my swimming pool for a mikveh. So here, if in fact one comes to the conclusion that this is a serious sha'as harchak, a serious extenuating circumstance, and how serious it is, again, depends on a judgment call about how dangerous is it to go to the mikveh, and how seriously should people's anxieties about that be taken, and so forth. But this issue of can I use the tap water to fill up a swimming pool is a relatively easy issue to be makel about in a somewhat emergency circumstance, perhaps depending on a specific location. But it would not be so far-fetched for a posek of standing to say that even though generally nowadays we don't rely on this, but there are certainly opinions to rely on to say that in a pinch, municipal water could be used for a mikveh, and that would then, in principle, allow you to use a swimming pool as a mikveh. Just one more minute before we move on to the next thing. It's very, very important, however, to emphasize that I just want to make sure this is not being covered later. It's very important to emphasize that just because tap water could potentially be considered kosher for a mikveh doesn't mean that the swimming pool, if you fill it up, is kosher. You still need, first of all, how do you fill up the swimming pool? Many people fill up their swimming pools by having a truck show up with a tank full of water and put that in the swimming pool. Obviously, that's mayim shuvim, was collected in the truck, right? But if you're in fact taking tap water, I just want to emphasize that it would still need to be done under the supervision of someone who is expert in the halachos of mikvahos, because there are all sorts of ancillary issues that we haven't mentioned that need to be taken into account. But in principle, that's not a far-fetched halachic conclusion. Okay.
So from that same time period, I just want to mention I have a book, Baruch Hashem, from my mother, who was going through my great-grandparents' library, of a book that was disseminated and written by a wealthy Jewish oil tycoon about how to build a mikveh in your closet for $5. So obviously the same types of halachot and the complications that you discussed would be relevant to that book today as well. Okay, so it seems like there might be a small chance one could have a completely 100% dry swimming pool that 40 se'ah of rainwater could fall into, which might be a kosher mikveh. But as you mentioned, very rarely are swimming pools filled up by tap water directly from the source or by rainwater. So we have to be very careful, and we really have to consult with rabbinic authority for a woman that might fit some sort of exceptional category that would want to consider this in a time of a highly contagious pandemic. So let's move on to the bathtub, a very different type of kli. So obviously, what we call a clawfoot bathtub that's not attached to the ground would not, as we've learned from Rabbi Berger, would not be kosher. But what about a bathtub that is mechubar lakarka, that is connected to the ground, which may fit the definitions of our bathtubs that are connected to the floor of the bathroom? While a swimming pool is also connected to the ground, it's halachically different from a bathtub in that the bathtub is also a kli, a man-made vessel. It's not as simply a hole dug into the ground. Can you explain how this adds to the halachic complexity of trying to use a bathtub as a mikveh?
Okay. So Stacy just expressed very well the key issue here. We've already been talking about kalim that were attached to the ground. And we said that there might be certain circumstances and certain configurations where, according to some poskim, you could construe such a thing as not a kli that would create mayim shuvim. But this situation is different, because in this situation, it's not just that I'm using water that had been collected in such an attached kli to put into my mikveh. In this case, I am actually using the kli as the mikveh, right? It's not that the water collects in a tank somewhere and then it comes out of the tap into a mikveh. It's the bathtub, the kli is where the person is going to dunk in the mikveh. That's a very different scenario. So we need to look at some source material on that topic. So let's share this again. Here we have some other sources. The Tur, which is one of the important codes of halacha from the 1300s, and was the basis for the later Shulchan Aruch a couple of hundred years later. The Tur writes, "Tzarich shelo yehiu arba'im sa'ah betoch hakli she'ein tovlin bekelim." The 40 sa'ah worth of water for a mikveh cannot be in a kli because you can't be tovel in a kli. Lefichach, therefore, he says, gigis shekva'uha ba'aretz. If you attached a gigis means basically a tank or a big tub. Okay, you might be familiar with that word. Shavuos is upcoming from the famous Medrash, Kafa Alehem Har Kegigis, right? That Hashem put the mountain over the Jewish people like a gigis, which is like a dome, right? That's just an upside down tank, right? An upside down tub. So the Tur says that if you put attached a gigis to the ground, and then it filled up with rainwater, ein tovlin ba. You may not be tovel in it. You may not go to the mikveh in it. Why? And this is the key line. Kevan shehaya shein kli aleha kodem shekva'uha. Because it was already a kli before you attached it. Since it was a kli before you attached it, therefore you can't use it as a mikveh. The Shach, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch there, makes the obvious deduction. He says, mashma, it sounds from the Tur, im lo haya aleha shein kli kodem shekva'uha, if it did not have a status of a kli before you attached it, then it would be kasher. Okay, then it would be okay to use as a mikveh. Okay, so the implication of the Tur is that as long as the kli was not fashioned into a kli before it was attached to the ground, it could still be used as a mikveh. Now, what about a bathtub? Is a bathtub fashioned into a kli before it's attached to the ground or only after? And here comes a very important element of this discussion, which is part of the early halachic literature as well, which is, obviously the instinctive answer is that, of course, a bathtub is manufactured before it's attached to the ground, right? It gets delivered to your house and it's already there, and only then do you attach it to the ground. But halachically, that's not really the case, because when the bathtub is delivered to your house, it has a big hole in the bottom where the drain is. And there's no drain, there's no plug attached there to hold in the water. If you have a big tank with a big hole in the bottom, that is halachically not a kli, because it can't actually hold anything. It's only a kli if it could actually hold something. So since you attached it to the ground when it still had this hole in it, that is actually considered a case of something that was only fashioned into a kli after it was attached to the ground. So you install it, and then you plug up the hole to fill it up with water. You're really making it into a kli only when the hole is blocked off. And so that would put the bathtub according to this, the implications of this Tur, into the category of something which you actually could use as a mikveh. Now, we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to read through the next sources inside. But the Tur does appear to say this. However, this becomes an issue of tremendous controversy in the Achronim starting in the 1700s. The big problem here is that while it does appear to be the case that the Tur said this and that the Shach followed up with it, the big problem is that it is very difficult to understand how this position of the Tur does not completely contradict the Gemara. If we go back in our source booklet here to that page with the chart here, what did we conclude here? What was in all of these categories? So which category was the Tur working with? The Tur was obviously assuming that this gigis, this tank, is in category number 2, Because if it was in category number 1, he wouldn't need to distinguish between whether it was created before it was attached or created after it was attached. The very fact that he's making this distinction means that he's placing this tank, this tub, squarely into category number 2. And what he's arguing is that because it's kava'o ulevasov chakako, because it was attached and only then fashioned into a kli, therefore it's not a kli. But the huge problem here is that, as we said before, that's only true for dinim derabanan, for derabanan applications. It's not true for deoraisa applications, for biblical applications. For all deoraisa considerations, it doesn't matter if it was attached before it was made into a kli or after. And as several of the greatest of the Achronim point out, the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Akiva Eger, and others, the issue that we're dealing with here is almost certainly, it's a virtual certainty, is a deoraisa issue. You're not allowed to be tovel in a kli. You have to be tovel, you have to dunk in the karka, in the ground. That was one of the fundamental halachos that we learned at the very beginning. So the question of whether I can go to the mikveh in a tub, which is actually being tovel in the kli, that's very, very much a doraisa question. And for doraisa questions, it shouldn't matter whether it was fashioned before or after it was attached to the ground. And so while the Tur does imply that this would be okay, it seems squarely contradicted by the Gemara. And so a great number of Achronim say that I'm sorry, I would very much like to follow the Tur, but if I have to face a contradiction between the Tur and the Gemara, we have to follow the Gemara and not the Tur. And there is a debate in the ensuing generations in the Achronim of, is the Tur defensible? Is there a way to somehow square the Tur's position with the Gemara? And there are Achronim who defend the Tur, and there are still more Achronim who don't really defend the Tur, but who say if someone follows the Tur, I can't say that they're doing something that's necessarily wrong. There were great Gedolei HaPoskim who defended that position. But certainly, by and large, not just by and large, in the centuries since, this position of the Tur has not been followed, right? And we never go to the mikveh in a kli that's attached to the ground, something like a tub. We only dig a hole in the ground. And that's clearly been the position throughout the generations. And as a result, it's almost impossible to suggest that one could be makel, that one could be lenient about this issue, even in the context of something like the coronavirus. It's not like the previous issue of relying on lenient opinions for mayim she'uvim if there were tanks in the municipal water system, because that was a real live debate. And historically, some people relied on that, some people didn't. When it comes to this issue, while it is a debate in principle, no one can really point to any actual case historically where this was actually done, where anybody actually allowed Tevilah in a kli, except for one. I'm only aware of one case historically where this was ever done, ever allowed. I mean, maybe it was some other time, but in the literature I've been able to find, I'm only aware of one case, and I would love to spend a few more minutes on it, but we're going to be out of time. And that's the last few pages of the booklet that you have, which was a tshuva of Rav Masas, was a very important posek. He was he was the Rav in Morocco, and then was brought to Eretz Yisrael to be I think the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, if I'm not mistaken, for a long time. One of the greatest Moroccan and the greatest North African poskim of the 20th century. And he has a tshuva where there was one circumstance where he was willing to allow this with certain restrictions. But that case, sometimes it's hard when you're going through something like the coronavirus. It's hard to recognize that, there have been greater emergencies in the history of the world. And the tshuva, the context he was talking about was in 1940, late 1940. Where entire Jewish communities had to escape from northern France because of the Nazi invasion, and there was the story there was a whole community of Jews who who had packed into Toulouse in southern France, and they were packed like 100 people to an apartment, and they were like just shoved together. The husbands and wives were like basically on top of each other, and there was no mikveh, and there was no end in sight, and it had gone on for months. And at that point, in that emergency, he was willing to rely on this tour to be Mako. Regardless of how one interprets what was going on last April and May, it does not reach in my opinion, certainly does not reach anything close to that event. And therefore, there isn't really any legitimate or reasonable room to rely on this kula in that circumstance, and therefore bathtubs cannot be used as a mikveh.
Okay.
Hey, Stacy.
And then I think I'm just going to summarize the next question without you going into it, because it seems pretty clear with all of the issues with bathtubs that we have the additional issue of most bathtubs do not hold the required amount of water of 40 sa'ah, right?
Right. I'll just say one sentence on that, which is that the minimum, the lowest shear for 40 sa'ah is 300 something liters, which is basically a typical American bathtub might actually meet the lower tier of shiurim for mem sa'ah, although it has to be careful that it has to hold mem sa'ah of water plus the person. Right. If when the person gets in it, half the water spills out, then there's not 40 sa'ah in there anymore. So it's possible under certain circumstances, but unlikely with a regular bathtub.
Okay. And now to end in our final question, I want to look beyond COVID, beyond the pandemic, as we begin to travel again, and we begin to think about our next vacation site, which amazingly during COVID has actually expanded to include places like Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where they are building a mikveh. So my question for you, Rabbi Berger, is Abu Dhabi is a desert, gets little to no rain. How can they possibly acquire the necessary rainwater to build a kosher mikveh?
Right. Okay. So I should mention that one possible simple answer to that question is that Abu Dhabi is, if I understand correctly, right on the coast of the Persian Gulf, right? So even though there's not much rain, there is an ocean nearby, and an ocean is a kosher mikveh. It's maybe worth mentioning that not every natural body of water is a kosher mikveh, so people should be aware of that. Depends how the water collected there, but an ocean is a kosher mikveh. So that would potentially be one solution, to build some structure around some beach somewhere and create a mikveh that way. But the other way that this is sometimes handled is with the use of ice. Ice can be brought, can be transported. This has been done many times historically. It's still being done now sometimes. Sometimes if a mikveh suddenly is drained accidentally, and in order to get enough rainwater to fill the mikveh, you have to wait a few weeks. So if they want to be able to operate that mikveh more quickly, so ice can be transported and then placed in the mikveh and then left to melt. There is a debate whether the halacha of mayim she'uvim applies to ice. So if I carry the ice inside kalim and bring it somewhere, is that called mayim she'uvim, or is it not called mayim she'uvim because the ice is a solid block anyway? It's not like water that's in a kli. And so there are many who are makel about that, and who will allow you to transport big blocks of ice to the location that you need, pile up the ice in the mikveh, and let it melt, and that could be a kosher mikveh. So that's something that has been that is a halachic angle that has been used historically in many circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Berger. And as we are one of the last sessions in the conference, I want to thank everybody who joined. If you registered, all of the sessions are available to you on recording and very easy to access. And thank you so much, Rabbi Berger, for sharing your expertise with us this evening. It was very informative, and I'm sure we all now understand how complicated this issue is of bathtubs and swimming pools. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.